I'm going to read to verse 37 and stop there, just so you know I'm not forgetting things. The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. Glory to you, O Lord. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. Don't read those other verses. There's so much in what we just read that is why I did not read the healing of the child. I like in our prayer of the day the line, "Transform us into the likeness of your Son, who renewed our humanity so that we may share in his divinity." Interesting. Take that bulletin home. That's better than anything you're going to hear the next 10 minutes. I wonder if that could be a Lenten goal, that we look to Jesus and ask that we might be transformed into the likeness of Jesus, who renewed our humanity so that we might share in his divinity. Amen. I listened in on some preachers talking about whether Transfiguration Sunday is really part of Lent, or maybe at least leans into Lent. Some glory before the somber season of Lent, maybe. Or if really Transfiguration Sunday is an ideal conclusion to the season of Epiphany. Perhaps that's a bit too churchy, the sort of thing only a minister would find interesting and a normal person would want to make it stop. Epiphany begins with the visit of the Magi to the Christ child, and the season that follows is in part a season to note that God has sent Jesus into all the world, not just for the people of Israel, but for us who must be adopted into God's family. The gift of the Christ child is a gift to bring all the world under God's wings, to wrap us all into God's arms of love. And Transfiguration brings us to the mountaintop, where with the disciples, Peter and John and James, we get to see Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. There the glory of God is shining forth, and in our small way, we get to be, to look in on and witness this as well. I remember years ago, it has to be 20-some years ago, I was talking to a seminary classmate of mine. And I said, "Hey, what are you going to be preaching on Transfiguration this Sunday?" And he said to me that he was having his associate pastor preach on it, because he said Transfiguration Sunday, he had preached so poorly on it in the years previous, it just depressed him. He said, the usual, you can't stay on the mountaintop, you got to get back to work sort of Transfiguration sermon, and it numbed his mind to even think about it. Well, that stuck with me for a couple of reasons. For one thing, I've preached that sermon, and that interpretation is not off base, it's the traditional interpretation. Basics has a song that goes through that interpretation of it. Hymn 315 in your hymnal, you could read that, and you get the basic Transfiguration sermon. How good, Lord, to be here. Hymn number 315, stanza 1. How good, Lord, to be here. Your glory fills the night. Your face and garments like the sun shine with unborrowed light. Isn't that great poetry? I mean, there's some extra hymnals on the shelf right outside that door. You could bring a hymnal home and use the hymnal for a devotional this Lent. And just read, the poetry of the hymns we've sung already is pretty wonderful. I love the last stanza of our gathering song. Well, how good, Lord, to be here. Back to the sermon. Get comfortable. Stanza 5. How good, Lord, to be here, yet we may not remain. But since you bid us leave the mount, come with us to the plain. That's good poetry. That's good preaching. You're going to get a different sermon right now. It does fit though, right? As we concluded our reading today, Jesus said, Luke tells us, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. And that makes sense. It's such a confusing story. It might be wise just to keep it to yourself. But then we hear that Jesus and the disciples are met by a great crowd. After the glory of the Transfiguration, there really is nothing to say, and they go right back to engaging the crowds, healing and teaching and more, as Jesus makes his way to Jerusalem. But I think my friend who made his associate pastor preach on this text, I laugh about that every time I think about it, he knew there's way more in this story, and it sort of disappointed him to have preached such a simple thing about it. I want to invite you to think about how this story might actually have that basic read on it, but also it may have something that would invite you into the very depths of our theological pondering of who Jesus is, who God is, and what it means that we have been called to be God's people in the world. And so I want to lay forth with you a sermon I've been a little reluctant to put together. But then I finally decided I'm going to do this. Because I'm going to argue with some other people. And they're nice people. And I'm not saying they're not nice people. And I'm not saying they're bad people. And I'm surely not going to claim that I'm a better person, because you know me too well for me to get away with that. But here we go. A couple weeks ago, a guy wrote the column for the pastor's column for the Sheridan paper. I like him. He's an enthusiastic and he's a nice guy. I want to point out he's not a pastor. He's a normal person. And that, of course, is not a problem. Might kind of be annoyed that he often tells me he used to be a Lutheran. I don't exactly remember what he said in the paper. But in this argument, I want to seek to be fair. And while I might not have his words exactly right, it would be accurate to say that he echoed a way of talking that we hear from a large part of the church. And it's a perspective that is a quite different way of considering the work of Christ than we consider it. And so at the point of explaining his argument too simply, here goes. He said he had a lifelong friend who was very grateful to him because he had witnessed to this friend and had helped this friend become a, quote, true Christian. I don't like that. His friend, before the witnessing, had thought he was a Christian, but now that he was a true Christian, he was so glad that the writer of this article had witnessed to him so he could become a true Christian. From the very beginning of the Reformation, Luther taught that one of the major errors of the church is claiming to know more than we can possibly know. We might well suspect that we see God at work in the world when we are at our very best. But it is the cross and the resurrection that show forth God's work in the world. God works by saving you in all your best and all your worst. God saves you. And the sign of that saving work is that in the water and the Word, God united you with Jesus Christ, with His life, death, and resurrection. You belong to Christ. God did it through Jesus' cross and resurrection. You are fed with bread and wine of Christ's body and blood. And I think it's hard to say that you might be a better eater now than you were way back when. Can you eat bread and wine? Then you're a Christian. Can you, most of us were a baby, can you not defend yourself from that minister who washes over you with the water and the Word? Then you are a really true Christian. I've had it up to here with true Christians. Doug Goodwin told me the other day that when he went to Israel, went on a trip and went to the Mount of the Transfiguration, the guide pointed out before they got out, you will notice, he went over the story again. Peter, how good, Lord, to be here. He said, you will notice that there's a church here. Maybe people didn't listen so well to Jesus, huh? We can't help but want to commemorate the event. We can't help but want to keep score. We can't help but want to kind of find ourselves to be really true Christians and kind of shake our heads at those other ones. God is the one who does the saving. We'd like to build a building to commemorate it, but all we get is only Jesus. We'd like to point and say, look here, it is so nice that I'm a better Christian now than I was before. Because if we can do that, then we get to take credit for being so fortunate, so blessed, so accomplished, and Jesus will have none of it. There's something about this story that strikes me so this time through. I've preached on it. I haven't had associate pastors to assign this text to. And I've rarely been wise enough to take vacation on Transfiguration Sunday. So I've had to preach this a bunch of times. Over 30. This time, this strikes me. Did you notice when the cloud appears? Jesus is transfigured and his face changes. His Clothes become dazzling white. Moses and Elijah are suddenly there speaking with him. And the disciples are sleepy, but they stay awake. So they see the clarity of this glory. Did you notice when it gets cloudy? When the preacher starts talking. I resent that. It's just amazing how that goes. Peter says, Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. That's point 1 of the sermon. He's about to go to point 2. And Luke tells us he was not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, they saw Jesus only. Isn't that wonderful? When does it get cloudy and hard to see? When Peter starts talking. Why do I even mention that? Isn't it fascinating that they know that it's Moses and Elijah? I've sometimes joked they were wearing jerseys with their number on it, or something like that. But if you were going to make a Mount Rushmore of Old Testament characters, you would for sure have Moses and Elijah, and then it might be debatable who the other 2 are. And so when Jesus appears here with Moses and Elijah, that's a way of saying this is God's full embracing and endorsement of who Jesus is. This is yet another sign from the heavens that Jesus indeed is God's Messiah, sent here and now with the bearer and presenter of the law, Moses, and with the prophet of prophets, Elijah. This is the one. This is the glorious God who created all and now has sent Jesus to make you God's own people. And it's glorious, and it's wonderful, and it's a mystery. And maybe I should just sit down and quit preaching, but you're not that fortunate. We have to be careful not to conclude that every unknown thing just go, well, it's all mystery, it's all mystery. Write a book or something. We have just concluded the season of rejoicing over the gift of Jesus given for all the world. And we note the deep mystery of this one who works God's wonders through Jesus Christ. Through the one who from here is going to set his face to go to Jerusalem. Our friend who wrote for the newspaper a few weeks ago does not really know if he or his buddy are better Christians now, but were worse before. That's up to God. That's more up to God than any of us really care to admit. Each and every one of us would like to be able to earn grades. And we'd like to suggest to God that we got an A- maybe, and maybe a B or C for those other people sitting here with us. Except for the folks who clearly are failing right now, they all get an F. You know who I mean. These certainties are anything but certain. And these resolutions to plant your flag here and say, I'm a really true Christian now, are placed in sinking sand. And one of the things about this grading way we kind of look at things, concluding that you used to think you were a Christian back then, but it only seemed like it, but now you really are a true Christian. There's a terribly deep problem with this. What do you do? When in the middle of the night the truth breaks in, and even now that you are a very true Christian, the best one around, You have decided that maybe you don't deserve an A-, but maybe a B+. What do you do? Because once you realize your grade should probably be a B+, you realize it's probably more of a C, and the next thing you know, you're working your way to a D, and let me tell you, things are going to get worse. That's just where it goes. Mary Luty, Luti, she writes the best devotions. She's such a beautiful writer. She tells a story about a preacher who was preaching a sermon, and she stopped in the middle of the sermon and she just said softly, "I have no idea what I'm talking about." And she kind of fumbled around, figured a way out of it, concluded her sermon. And afterwards, nobody said anything about it except for one person came up to her and said, "I wanted to scream out, hallelujah." Finally, one minister admitted that they don't really know. The Transfiguration is an experience of the glory of God, an experience of the mystery of God, and really also an experience of the hidden God. I had typed the hiddenness of God, and my computer fixed that. The hidden mess of God. We're the mess, right? God is hidden. What do Jesus and Moses and Elijah speak about there? About his departure, we're told here, right? The Greek word there is exodus. About his exodus. In the first exodus, Moses, by God's guiding, led the people out of slavery into freedom. In the cross and resurrection, we have a new exodus where God leads us out of our abandonment into God's presence, into God's saving love, into God's saving grace. Out of the cloud, the voice says, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And so to you I say, listen for all you are worth. Listen carefully to the one who will proclaim to you God's full of forgiveness, God's unending love, God's free grace, given and certain, no matter how mediocre a Christian you can possibly be, for it's entirely and completely up to Jesus, up to this one whose face shines forth with God's unending love, up to this one who fully and completely and totally gives his entire self for you, entirely. And you don't get to be a mediocre Christian. All you get to be is God's beloved child, held close in God's arms, loved totally, and sent to love as mediocre as you love. But God will delight in all you bear to this world. Thanks be to God. Amen.